November 23rd, 1942. The frigid waters of the North Atlantic heaved and crashed against the sides of the USS Lakehurst, a converted merchant vessel carrying over 1,000 American troops bound for the European theater. In the cramped galley below deck, Petty Officer Third Class Raymond Sullivan wiped sweat from his brow as he frantically counted the remaining flour sacks. His calculations confirmed his worst fear. They had supplies for 3 more days, perhaps 4 if strictly rationed, despite being at least 12 days from port. The storm that had blown them severely off course had sealed what seemed to be their inevitable fate. What Sullivan couldn't possibly know was that his unorthodox approach to bread making, long ridiculed by fellow Navy cooks, would soon be the difference between life and death for everyone aboard. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable tale of how conventional military wisdom can fail in the face of crisis, and how salvation sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. In this case, from a stubborn cook with a peculiar approach to bread making who would challenge naval culinary doctrine and transform how an entire fleet approached survival at sea. The morning had begun like any other for Sullivan. At 37, he was significantly older than most of the enlisted men aboard the Lakehurst. His weathered face bore the marks of someone who had spent more years in kitchens than most of his shipmates had been alive. While most Navy cooks had received their training through the standard military culinary program, Sullivan had come from a different world entirely. Before the war, he had owned a small but respected bakery in Portland, Maine, where his naturally leavened breads had earned him a modest reputation among locals who appreciated traditional baking methods. "Another day of making that terrible excuse for bread," groaned Seaman Lewis Chen, Sullivan's 19-year-old assistant, as he entered the galley at 4:30 in the morning. The standard Navy recipe, which Sullivan was required to follow despite his protests, produced a dense, quick-rising loaf using large quantities of yeast, white flour, salt, sugar, and fat. "Good morning to you too, Chen," Sullivan replied, already mixing ingredients for the first batch of the day. "And yes, another day of making what the Navy, in its infinite wisdom, believes bread should be." "You know my mother would weep if she saw what we're calling bread," Chen said, washing his hands before joining Sullivan at the mixing table. Chen came from a family that had operated a bakery in San Francisco's Chinatown for 2 generations before the war. "Your mother and I would get along just fine," Sullivan said with a knowing smile. "In my bakery, I'd let dough ferment for at least 12 hours before baking. Used just a fraction of the yeast they make us dump in here. Created a natural starter that I nurtured for 15 years. The flavor was incomparable." Yeah, we've all heard about your magic bread, Sully," called out Seaman First Class Walter Kensington from the doorway. Kensington, a burly former football player from Nebraska who worked in the ship's engine room, had stopped by hoping to snag a fresh roll before the morning rush. "But I'd take this Navy bread over nothing. When you're hungry enough, anything tastes good." "There's hungry and then there's nourished," Sullivan replied, not looking up from his work. "They're not the same thing." The conversation might have continued along its usual path, good-natured ribbing about Sullivan's obsession with proper bread-making, had Chief Petty Officer Frank Harrington not burst into the galley at that moment, his face grave. "Sullivan, Chen, Captain wants all department heads and supply officers in the wardroom immediately," Harrington said. "What's happening, Chief?" Sullivan asked, wiping flour from his hands. "Storm knocked us way off course. We're running dangerously low on supplies," Harrington replied. "Radio's damaged too. Captain's calling an emergency meeting." In the wardroom, Captain Malcolm Reynolds stood before a map spread across the table, surrounded by his officers. At 45, Reynolds had the bearing of a man who had spent his entire adult life at sea. His voice was steady, but those who knew him well could detect the underlying tension. "Gentlemen, I won't sugarcoat this," Reynolds began. "The storm has pushed us nearly 300 miles off course. Our radio is functioning intermittently at best. Based on current speed and heading, we're at least 12 days from reaching Liverpool, possibly longer if we encounter more bad weather, which the barometric readings suggest is likely." Lieutenant Commander James Wilson, the ship's executive officer, spoke up. "What's our supply situation, sir?" "Critical," Reynolds replied. Lieutenant Parker, break it down for them. Lieutenant Edgar Parker, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses who served as the supply officer, cleared his throat. We have standard rations for approximately 4 days, possibly 5, if we implement severe restrictions immediately. Fresh water is adequate for now, but food is the primary concern. What about emergency rations? Asked Lieutenant Wilson. Limited, Parker replied. Even with those factored in, we're looking at a significant shortage. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Over 1,000 men, including the crew and the troops being transported, facing starvation at sea. Options, gentlemen, Captain Reynolds asked, his eyes moving from one officer to another. Various suggestions were offered, reducing portions immediately, stretching supplies by adding more water to soups and stews, implementing a strict rationing system based on work duties, but none addressed the fundamental problem. They simply did not have enough food to last until they reached port. Sullivan, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke up. Captain, I might have a solution. It's unconventional, but it could work. All eyes turned to the cook, most with skeptical expressions. Go ahead, Sullivan, Reynolds said. We have a significant amount of flour remaining, about 800 pounds, Sullivan began. Standard Navy procedure calls for using that flour with our remaining yeast to make bread following the official recipe. That would give us enough bread for perhaps 4 days. Yes, and? Lieutenant Parker prompted impatiently. I propose we abandon the Navy recipe entirely, Sullivan said, causing several officers to exchange glances. Instead, I want to use a traditional sourdough method that requires no commercial yeast, very little salt, and no sugar or fat. The fermentation process breaks down the flour in ways that make it more digestible and nutritious. Most importantly, it creates a bread that's far more filling than what we currently make. Sullivan, this isn't the time for your bread crusade, Chief Harrington interrupted. We need practical solutions. This is practical, Chief, Sullivan insisted, his voice gaining strength. With my method, we could stretch our flour supply to make bread for at least 10 days, possibly more. The fermentation process actually increases the volume of what we can produce while making it more nutritious. That's impossible, Lieutenant Parker scoffed. You can't create more food from the same ingredients. Actually, you can, Sullivan countered. The fermentation process breaks down the flour in ways that make it more bioavailable. More of its nutrients can be absorbed by the body. And the natural bacteria create additional B vitamins. The bread is more filling and provides more sustained energy. Captain Reynolds studied Sullivan thoughtfully. You're certain of this? Yes, sir. Before the war, this was my profession. I've seen the difference it makes. The men won't like it, Chief Harrington warned. Sourdough has a tangy taste that... With respect, Chief, Sullivan interrupted. The men will like starvation even less. After a moment of tense silence, Captain Reynolds nodded. Sullivan, work up a detailed plan for this approach. I want to see exactly how you propose to implement it, including precise calculations on how long our supplies will last. Have it on my desk in 2 hours. Aye, sir, Sullivan responded, already mentally calculating how to convert the ship's galley operations to his proposed method. Back in the galley, Sullivan explained the situation to Chen as they hurriedly worked on the captain's requested plan. So you're finally going to make your fancy bread, Chen said, helping Sullivan inventory their remaining supplies. If the captain approves, yes, Sullivan replied, writing figures on a clipboard. But this isn't about fancy bread, Chen. This is about survival. How does this sourdough thing work anyway? Chen asked. You've talked about it, but I've never actually seen it done. We need to create a starter first, Sullivan explained. It's a mixture of flour and water that captures wild yeast and beneficial bacteria from the air. Once it's active, it becomes our leavening agent instead of commercial yeast. Wild yeast? From the air? On a ship in the middle of the ocean? Chen looked skeptical. There's wild yeast everywhere, son, even here, Sullivan said with confidence. But to be safe, I brought insurance. He reached into his footlocker and pulled out a small glass jar containing a greyish paste. What's that? Chen asked, leaning in to look. A bit of my starter from home, Sullivan said, a hint of pride in his voice. 15 years old. I've been feeding it small amounts of flour and water every few days since we shipped out, against regulations, of course. Chen's eyes widened. You smuggled sourdough starter onto a Navy vessel. Sullivan shrugged. Call it a baker's security blanket. Never thought it would save 1,000 lives. 2 hours later, Sullivan presented his plan to Captain Reynolds. His proposal was meticulous, detailing how they would create multiple sourdough starters to handle the volume needed, how the bread would be produced on a staggered schedule to ensure maximum efficiency, and precise calculations showing how they could stretch their flour supply to last at least 10 days, possibly 12 with careful management. The key is the extended fermentation, Sullivan explained. It increases the bread's digestibility and creates a more filling loaf. Men will feel satisfied longer on smaller portions. Captain Reynolds studied the proposal carefully before looking up at Sullivan. The first batch of bread using this method, when would it be ready? The starters will take approximately 36 hours to become active enough. After that, each batch of dough needs about 24 hours of fermentation, so the first bread would be ready in roughly 60 hours, sir. Reynolds frowned. That's 2.5 days without fresh bread. Yes, sir. I recommend we use a small portion of our remaining standard rations during that period, supplemented with a very thin porridge I can make from some of the flour to stretch supplies. The captain was silent for a long moment, weighing the risks. Finally, he nodded. Very well, Sullivan. You have authorization to implement this plan, effective immediately. I'm putting the lives of everyone aboard in your hands. I understand the responsibility, sir. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Reynolds said gravely. If this fails, we'll be in an even worse position than we are now. Word of the dire situation and Sullivan's unorthodox solution spread quickly throughout the ship. Reactions were mixed. Some men, particularly those who had survived difficult circumstances before, accepted the news with stoic resignation. Others were skeptical, even angry. So our lives depend on some cook's crazy bread experiment? Growled Sergeant Thomas Blackwell, a hardened Marine who had been in the Pacific before being reassigned to the European theater. Great. Just great. I heard this Sullivan guy actually knows what he's doing, said Private First Class Michael O'Malley, a fresh-faced 19-year-old from Boston. Owned some fancy bakery before the war. A civilian baker? That's who's deciding if we eat or starve. Blackwell spat on the deck. Military has procedures for a reason. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hamilton, the highest-ranking officer among the troops being transported, had been briefed personally by Captain Reynolds about the situation. Now he addressed the men under his command. Listen up, Hamilton said, his authoritative voice cutting through the murmurs of discontent. Captain Reynolds has made a difficult decision based on the recommendations of his crew. This is not up for debate or discussion. We will follow this new rationing plan, and yes, we will eat this new bread when it becomes available. Anyone caught hoarding food or complaining in a manner that affects morale will be dealt with severely. Is that understood? Yes, sir, came the collective response, though many faces remained doubtful. Meanwhile, in the galley, Sullivan had begun the process of creating multiple sourdough starters. He mixed flour and water in several large containers, carefully covering them with clean cloths. Now we wait, he told Chen. These need to be kept at a consistent temperature and stirred every few hours. What if they don't start bubbling? Chen asked, peering at the unimpressive-looking mixture. They will, Sullivan said with the confidence of experience. But if they don't show signs of activity within 24 hours, I'll introduce a small amount of my personal starter to each container. The next day and a half were tense. Rations were cut to minimum levels, with men receiving just enough to keep them functioning. A thin porridge, made from a small portion of their flour supply as Sullivan had suggested, provided some sustenance, but complaints were common. This isn't enough to keep a bird alive, let alone grown men, grumbled Seaman Philip Morris as he stared at his meager breakfast portion. Eat what you're given and be grateful, barked Chief Petty Officer Harrington, who was overseeing the meal service. There are men in this war going days without any food at all. In the galley, Sullivan and Chen, along with 2 additional assistants assigned to help with the emergency bread production, monitored the sourdough starters anxiously. By the 30-hour mark, all of the containers were showing encouraging signs, bubbles forming on the surface and a distinctly tangy smell developing. It's working, Sullivan said, unable to hide his relief. "Now we can begin making the first batches of dough." The process was labor-intensive. Sullivan directed his team as they mixed the active starter with more flour and water in large mixing bowls. Unlike the quick-rise navy bread, which could be mixed, risen, and baked in a few hours, Sullivan's method required multiple stages of fermentation. "We'll let this first rise happen for about 12 hours, he explained. "Then we'll fold the dough, not knead it, fold it, to redistribute the yeast and strengthen the gluten structure. After that, another 12 hours of fermentation before shaping and baking." 24 hours just to make bread? One of the new assistants, Seaman Robert Johnson, asked incredulously. 24 hours to make bread that will help keep 1,000 men alive, Sullivan corrected him. "There's a difference." As the first batches of dough underwent their long fermentation, Sullivan continued production, creating a staggered schedule that would eventually allow for continuous bread output once the system was fully operational. Captain Reynolds visited the galley frequently, checking on progress and asking detailed questions about the process. His concern was evident, though he maintained the composed demeanor expected of a commanding officer. "The men are growing restless, Sullivan," he confided during one such visit, 60 hours into the journey. "This reduced rationing is taking a toll on morale." "The first loaves will be ready for baking in approximately 4 hours, sir," Sullivan assured him. "By evening meal, everyone will have their first portion of the new bread." Reynolds nodded. "I hope it lives up to your claims." "It will, sir." The moment of truth came that evening. Sullivan and his team had been baking continuously for hours, producing large, rustic loaves of sourdough bread. The aroma filled the ship, drawing curious onlookers to the galley, despite orders to remain at their stations. "Smells different," Chief Harrington commented, having appointed himself unofficial quality control officer. "That's the fermentation," Sullivan explained, sliding another batch of shaped loaves into the ovens. "It creates compounds that aren't present in standard bread." When the first loaves were finally ready for distribution, Captain Reynolds insisted on being present. The evening meal, a thin stew made from the last of their canned meat, supplemented with the new bread, was served to the crew first, then to the troops. Sullivan watched anxiously as men received their portions. Each man was given a generous slice of the sourdough bread, noticeably smaller in volume than their usual ration of navy bread, but significantly denser. The reactions were varied. Some men eyed the bread suspiciously, noting its different appearance and smell. Others tore into it immediately, hunger overriding any concerns about the unfamiliar food. "It's sour," complained Sergeant Blackwell after his first bite. "It's bread," replied Colonel Hamilton, who had chosen to eat with his men rather than in the officers' mess, and right now that's what matters. As men finished their meals, Sullivan noticed something encouraging. There were fewer requests for additional portions than usual. Captain Reynolds noticed it too. "They seem more satisfied," he observed quietly to Sullivan. "The bread is more filling," Sullivan confirmed. "The long fermentation breaks down the complex carbohydrates, making them easier to digest, but also making the bread more satisfying. They'll feel full longer on less food." Over the next few days, the sourdough bread production continued around the clock. Sullivan and his team worked in shifts, maintaining the starters, mixing dough, managing the fermentation process, and baking continuously. The staggered production schedule Sullivan had designed began to pay off, with fresh bread becoming available at regular intervals. By the 5th day of the new rationing system, even the skeptics had to admit that Sullivan's bread was making a difference. Men reported feeling more satisfied and having more energy, despite the reduced overall calories. "I don't understand it," Chief Harrington admitted to Sullivan during a rare break. "By all rights, these men should be weakening, but if anything, they seem to be holding steady." "It's not just about calories, Chief," Sullivan explained patiently. "It's about nutrition. The fermentation process makes the nutrients in the flour more bioavailable. The body can access and use them more efficiently. Commercial yeast doesn't do that. It just creates gas to make the bread rise quickly." "So all these years you were right about navy bread being inferior?" Harrington asked with a raised eyebrow. Sullivan gave a tired smile. "I wouldn't go that far. Navy bread has its place, it's quick to make and consistent, but in this situation traditional methods are proving their worth." By the 8th day at sea, The success of Sullivan's bread strategy was undeniable. Though the men were certainly hungry and eager to reach port, there were no signs of the deterioration that might be expected with such limited rations. Morale, while not high, remained stable. Captain Reynolds called Sullivan to his quarters that evening for a private conversation. "I've been observing the men carefully," Reynolds said, gesturing for Sullivan to take a seat. "They're holding up remarkably well under the circumstances. Your bread strategy appears to be working." "Thank you, sir," Sullivan replied. "We should be able to maintain this level of production for at least 4 more days with our remaining flour." Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. "Our navigator estimates we're still about 6 days from Liverpool, assuming weather remains favorable. It's going to be close." "We'll make it, sir," Sullivan said with quiet confidence. "There's something else I wanted to discuss," Reynolds continued after a moment. "I've been in the Navy for 23 years. I've seen many innovations come and go, but I've never seen anything quite like this. A solution so simple yet so effective, hiding in plain sight all along." Sullivan shifted uncomfortably under the captain's praise. "I just applied what I knew, sir." "That's precisely my point, Sullivan. You brought civilian expertise into a military situation and saved lives in the process." Reynolds leaned forward. "I intend to write a full report about this incident when we reach port. With your permission, I'd like to recommend that your bread method be studied for potential implementation throughout the fleet, at least as an emergency protocol." Sullivan was momentarily speechless. "Of course, sir, I'd be honored." "Good," Reynolds said with a nod of finality. "Now get some rest. You look like you haven't slept in days. 4 hours at a stretch is all I can manage, sir, with the production schedule. Find a way to get more. That's an order. You're no good to us if you collapse." "Aye, sir." As Sullivan made his way back to the galley, he was stopped by a group of Marines, including Sergeant Blackwell, who had been one of the most vocal critics of the sourdough bread initially. "Sullivan," Blackwell called out, his voice gruff but lacking its earlier hostility. "Got a minute?" Sullivan paused, too tired to be concerned about whatever complaint might be coming. "What can I do for you, Sergeant?" To Sullivan's surprise, Blackwell extended his hand. "Wanted to say I was wrong about your bread. Still tastes funny to me, but it's keeping us going. Figured you deserved to hear that." Sullivan shook the offered hand, touched by the unexpected acknowledgement. "Thank you, Sergeant. That means a lot." "My grandfather was a farmer in Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl," Blackwell continued, his voice quieter now. "He used to talk about how they had to get creative to survive. Said innovation comes from necessity. Guess he was right." As the days continued to pass, the weather finally turned in their favor. Clear skies and favorable winds increased their speed, and the navigator revised his estimate. They might reach Liverpool in 5 days rather than 6. On the 11th day at sea, with flour supplies dwindling to critically low levels, the lookout spotted something that sent a wave of excitement through the ship, the outline of another vessel on the horizon. "British destroyer, sir," reported the lookout to Captain Reynolds. "Coming toward us." Reynolds immediately ordered signal flags hoisted to request assistance. Within hours, the British destroyer HMS Valiant had pulled alongside the Lakehurst, and communication was established. "They're offering to transfer supplies, Lieutenant Wilson reported excitedly, after exchanging signals with the British vessel. A cheer went up from the men who had gathered on deck, watching the proceedings with hungry anticipation. The transfer of supplies was quickly arranged. Using small boats, the British sent over emergency rations, including canned meat, vegetables, and, much to everyone's amusement, several sacks of flour. The British commanding officer, Commander William Hensley, came aboard the Lakehurst briefly to meet with Captain Reynolds. "Quite a journey you've had," Hensley remarked after hearing a condensed version of their ordeal. "Ingenious solution with the bread. One of our ship's cooks trained in France before the war. He does something similar when supplies run low." "It saved us," Reynolds acknowledged. "We'll be studying the method for potential wider implementation." "Smart," Hensley agreed. "The old ways sometimes prove their worth in modern crises." With the additional supplies from the British destroyer, the final days of the journey passed with relative ease. Rations were increased slightly, though Sullivan insisted on continuing the sourdough bread production rather than reverting to the standard Navy recipe. "No sense changing what's working," Captain Reynolds agreed when Sullivan proposed this. On the morning of the 14th day at sea, the Lakehurst finally entered Liverpool harbour. As the ship docked, a small crowd of British naval personnel and dock workers gathered, having heard radio reports about the vessel's dramatic journey. Before the men disembarked, Captain Reynolds called for their attention one final time. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying across the deck, "we have faced a serious challenge together and have come through it due to resourcefulness, discipline and cooperation. Each of you has played a part in our survival. However, I would like to recognize one man whose expertise and dedication made the difference between potential disaster and our successful arrival." Reynolds gestured for Sullivan to join him. The cook stepped forward reluctantly, uncomfortable with being singled out. "Petty Officer Third Class Raymond Sullivan," Reynolds continued, "devised and implemented the bread production strategy that stretched our limited supplies and kept over 1,000 men adequately nourished during our extended journey. His knowledge, brought from civilian life and adapted to military necessity, exemplifies the kind of innovative thinking that will help us win this war." A spontaneous round of applause broke out, growing in intensity as men who had initially been skeptical of Sullivan's ridiculous bread recipe now recognized its life-saving importance. Later that day, as troops and supplies were being offloaded, Lieutenant Colonel Hamilton sought out Sullivan, who was supervising the cleaning of the galley in preparation for restocking. "Sullivan," Hamilton said, extending his hand, "I wanted to thank you personally before my men and I head inland. What you did was remarkable." Sullivan shook the offered hand. "Just doing my job, sir." Hamilton smiled. "No, you weren't. You were doing far more than your job. You were challenging conventional wisdom when lives depended on it. That takes a special kind of courage." He paused, then added, "I've recommended you for a commendation." "That's not necessary, sir," Sullivan protested. "Maybe not, but it's deserved," Hamilton replied firmly. "The best military minds learn from every source available, even from bakers who insist on doing things the old-fashioned way." In the months that followed, Sullivan's sourdough method was indeed studied by naval supply officers and nutritionists. A classified report, circulated among fleet commanders in both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters, detailed the nutritional advantages of traditionally fermented bread, particularly in emergency situations with limited supplies. By mid-1943, modified versions of Sullivan's approach had been implemented on several naval vessels, particularly those undertaking extended missions where resupply opportunities were limited or uncertain. While the standard Navy bread recipe remained in use for routine operations, Sullivan's ridiculous bread recipe had earned its place in the official emergency protocols. Sullivan himself returned to sea after a brief leave, continuing to serve as a ship's cook for the duration of the war. While he maintained his preference for traditional bread-making methods, he developed a newfound respect for the military's need for standardization and efficiency under normal circumstances. After the war ended in 1945, Sullivan returned to Portland and reopened his bakery. On the wall behind the counter, alongside family photos and local news clippings, hung a framed letter from Captain Reynolds, recounting how one baker's stubborn insistence on traditional methods had saved 1,000 lives at sea. Sullivan rarely spoke about his wartime experience, preferring to let his bread speak for itself. But occasionally, when a customer would comment on the distinctive tang of his sourdough, he would smile and say, "There's more to bread than most people realize. Sometimes the old ways are the best ways, especially when it matters most." The story of the USS Lakehurst and its emergency bread strategy eventually became part of naval lore taught at culinary training facilities as an example of how specialized civilian knowledge can be adapted to meet military challenges. More broadly, it served as a reminder that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, and that sometimes the solutions to the most pressing problems have existed all along, waiting to be recognized and implemented by someone with the courage to challenge conventional wisdom. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.